wife and I bought a house that was quite cheap for the area, and that was 2 years ago. We have 2 daughters together. At first, everything was fine, and nothing out of the ordinary ever happened. Then one day we would find every chair, pot, jar and other household objects all divided into 2 corners. One corner of the household objects had a red mark on them, while the other half of household objects had a blue mark. We tried putting things back to where they were supposed to go, but everything ended up being divided into their corners again. Then one day I awoke with a blue mark on my arm, and same with my oldest daughter. We both found ourselves with the other household objects that also had a blue mark on them. My wife and my youngest daughter had a red mark on them, and they awoke alongside the household objects that had a red mark on them as well. We then brought in a psychic, and she told us that the spirits from the married couple who used to live in this house are now finally divorcing in the afterlife. They have split up everything 50-50 and marked them red and blue. Red is for the deceased husband, and the blue is for the deceased wife. My wife and I looked at each other, as we both knew we would be taken away. We knew we had to get out of this house or sell it as quick as possible. Then one day, some of the household objects that were divided into red and blue had disappeared. Our daughters were part of the disappearance. The 2 spirits are slowly taking their 50-50 divorce splits. Me and my wife are just waiting for us to get taken now. Hello, let me tell you about a story about a detective called Mason. He had a brilliant idea for investigating crime scenes. The idea wasn't his, of course. It had been used for years and years and could have been forgotten about, but different investigators still use it when investigating crime scenes. The idea is creating a miniature model of the whole crime scene. For instance, if it was a farmhouse with 2 people and one stabbed with a knife, then create a model of that entire scene. Mason used to find it very helpful to be able to look at the model of the crime scene and go through it in his mind what could have happened. This method helped Mason solve lots of different crimes. Mason's wife Susan was a teacher in the local school and used to often worry about Mason out and about in his job, but she used to like when he was in the basement with his crime scene miniatures because she knew he was safe at home and wasn't in the way of any criminal that could harm him or worse, kill him. One day there was a murder in the school, and Mason had to do a miniature of the hallway by the lockers where the murder took place. He knew that there was just lockers, a school bag and a boy that seemed to have been hit by a hammer. Mason was working hard trying to figure out what he could see in it. Sometimes he wondered, was it harder there being a lot to the scene or less? But he knew one thing, that no matter how much there was in the scene or how little, it seemed to help him having a miniature model. That night Mason seemed to have had a nightmare and woke up feeling agitated after it. He got up to get a glass of water. On his way, by accident, he knocked against his wife's handbag and it fell to the floor, with some of its contents spilt out on the floor. He froze in fear when he saw what he saw staring up at him from the floor. It was a hammer with what looked like blood on the top. He looked back at the bed, hoping Susan wouldn't wake up. He put it together. Susan had been talking about a boy who was constantly bullying her behind people's backs, and she was afraid to tell anyone because she felt they would think she had no control over her students. Mason knew the student was hit with a blunt object, which was very highly likely to be the hammer. Mason felt movement from the bed and quickly put the hammer back into Susan's bag. He went down to the kitchen and drank some water, and then walked back to the basement and looked at the miniature model. He imagined Susan striking the student on the head with a hammer, and knew that he heard the CCTV footage was missing, and that would be explained by Susan being able to have access to it to delete it. Every piece of the puzzle was falling into place. Suddenly he heard movement behind him and looked around. His wife Susan was standing next to him with a miniature model of himself lying in a pool of blood. She put the miniature model of him down on the ground and said, "Well, Mason, I was really hoping it wouldn't come to this, where I have to finish this miniature crime scene, but it looks like I'll have to make the background or basement." She pulled out a gun and shot Mason in his head. 6 months later, Susan was speaking at the book launch of her bestseller called My Husband is Gone, But I Continued His Passion. She spoke into the mic with emotion. "I am here today talking about my book, which is a way of me coping with the murder of my hard-working husband, who was passionate about figuring out ways of solving crimes by using miniature crime scene models. The title is long, but I couldn't think of any other appropriate title to use other than My Husband is Gone, But I Continued His Passion. My husband was such a loving man, and the only time I was truly content with him working on his investigations was when he was in the basement working on his miniature crime scene models. After my husband died, I tried to harness my emotions into making a miniature crime scene of him in honor of him. I would love if my husband was still alive and I didn't have to write this book, but I want to speak out to the many wives of men like my husband. Don't take a day for granted, because if your husband is working in a dangerous line of work like mine was, then his life could be snuffed out at any minute." The crowd were lapping up Susan's speech, and Susan was enjoying knowing she would get lots of royalties from her books and TV appearances, etc., and her bully was out of the way. She paused for a moment, thinking to herself, "I didn't want to appear a pushover teacher by saying I couldn't control my student, and I didn't want to harm my loving husband, but I had to. I wasn't a murderer, so it's better I got a book deal and wasn't cut out as the murderer. They would think I was some sort of psycho." She saw a fly land in her hand and thought to herself, "After all, I wouldn't hurt a fly." Martin was driving towards the next town as he had an important appointment for work in the morning. It was only 8 p.m, but he felt very sleepy. The next town was a 2-hour journey, so he made sure to drink 3 cups of coffee before making the drive. He would have loved to have been at home with his wife in bed, but he had to be at a meeting at 8 p.m, so he decided to drive to the next town and stay in the local motel. Back in Martin's house, his wife Marta rang Simon, who she was having an affair with. She said to him, "Come over, baby, he's finally gone. I can't wait until you get here, and we will make up for lost time." Simon smiled and said he will be looking forward also. Martin was feeling very tired and was cursing the coffee for not working. Suddenly he heard a thump. He realized he must have fell asleep. Then he realized he hit something. He was in shock and walked out of the car and nearly fainted when he saw a girl lying down dead on the road. He had just ran over a girl who must have been hitchhiking. He couldn't think of any other reason why she would have been out on the road in the dark. Back in the house, Simon told Martha how much he loved her and they started kissing. Suddenly Martha's phone rang and she answered. Martin was almost crying and said, "Sweetie, I just ran over a girl. I killed a girl, sweetie. She was on the street hitchhiking and I fell asleep and hit her." Martha said, "Sweetie, you need to call the police right away and tell them it was an accident." When Martin hung up, a man came out of the bushes and shouted at him, "You bastard, what did you do to my girlfriend? I was just in the bushes collecting a bag of weed and I come back and see my girlfriend ran over. You think you're going to get away with this?" Martin said, "Sir, I'm so sorry, but I didn't see your girlfriend. She must have been in the middle of the road. It was an accident." The man took out a gun and said to Martin, "You pitiful fool, you expect me to believe you will be punished for what you did? You will just get a slap on the wrist and maybe get a few months in prison at most. But they will just say it was an accident, so I got a different idea. I'm going to make you pay right now, you bastard." The man pulled the trigger and shot the man in the head. Simon was very happy and looking forward to see Martha, and he was very excited knowing her husband Martin was going to stay in the next town, so he could even stay the night. Suddenly something moved, and before he realized there was a girl with her thumb out just in front of him, he lost control at the wheel and hit her. He panicked and drove on. Martin's car passed him. He could have sworn Martin didn't see him, because as strange as it looked, Martin seemed to have been falling asleep, and he wouldn't have known only for the light in the car on. Even if he wasn't asleep, he guessed Martin would have no idea it was him in the car, and hopefully he won't know it was him who ran that girl over.